The minimum wage takes center stage in the race for governor, and the primary is just weeks away. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Happy New Year to everyone. And to kick off the new year and the new political season, a couple of seasoned guys who know this stuff. So glad to have them with me once again. Kent Redfield is here, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at University of Illinois Springfield. Kent, welcome back.
Good to be here.
And happy 2014.
Yes, same to
Charlie
you.
Wheeler is here, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Also was a long time, it's been a while doing that, but a long time with the Chicago Sun-Times at the Capitol before that. Charlie, welcome back.
Thanks, Bernie. It's always good to be here.
Minimum wage. This is an issue that is less complicated than some that we often talk about when talking about state government. We've just been through the legislature in a special session fixing, supposedly at least, passing a fix to long-term pension debt. Now we're talking about a minimum wage in Illinois that's $8.25. Some tape that showed up of Bruce Rauner, a candidate for governor on the Republican side, saying at a forum that he wanted Illinois to be on par with states around us at the federal level, which is $1 less, $7.25. Then all of a sudden, after a couple of days of trouble about this and a bus tour for Mr. Rauner in Southern Illinois, where questions about this continued to rise, he says what he really wants is for the federal level to be raised and Illinois to go along with that, perhaps to $10. So who wants to take this one on? And as Pat Quinn, of course, has been going for a $10, an increase to $10 in Illinois, and so everybody's now attacking Bruce. Where are we?
Well, it occurs to me that Rauner was probably speaking from the heart what he truly believes in those comments that he made, I guess it was more than a month ago, to a friendly audience, and he didn't think anybody was going to be there to leak it to the broader world. And suddenly it comes out, and here's this guy who had income reported of excess of $50 million last year, and suddenly he's arguing that we should take $1 away per hour from the lowest working poor in the state of Illinois, and it just doesn't look good politically. So he does a 180 and says, well, that's really not, I was being flippant, I didn't really explain myself well. What I really wanted to do is see the federal minimum wage increase so everybody would do better. So it's pretty much damage recovery, and I think it's motivated in part by the recognition that polling shows people across the board of almost all political stripes, Republicans and Democrats, favor the notion of having a higher minimum wage so that people who work full-time aren't living in poverty.
Kent?
And, we can have economic arguments, dueling economists about the impact of raising the minimum wage, but as a political issue, it just, it looks terrible in the best of circumstances to say, I want to cut the minimum wage and pay poor workers less. And then when you have the optics of an obviously tremendously wealthy candidate saying that, then it looks bad. And the problem long term is if this is just one incident, that's not that big a deal probably in the big scheme of things. If this becomes part of a narrative about how Bruce Rauner is not in touch with working people, he doesn't understand the real world, he's one more rich guy that wants to come in and take over government. And so if this becomes part of a larger narrative, then that really causes problems. The other thing is if you walk it back with an editorial in the Tribune, or you walk it back with a 2 or 3 minute explanation of your theory of economics, that doesn't stand up to the 30-second commercial that someone's going to run with him saying, I think we should cut the minimum wage. And if his opponents in the primary don't do it, and if he makes it to the general, you can guarantee that Pat Quinn will be running that commercial.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that he's a first-time candidate, and he is He has a lot of money. In fact, just this last week he put in, there was a report of another $1 million, which means he's up to about $2.25 million of his own money that he has put in. Whereas that is dwarfing what the other candidates are doing. And let's see, we have State Senators Bill Brady of Bloomington, Kirk Dillard of Hinsdale, and State Treasurer Dan Rutherford of Chenoa. Rutherford, for example, put out a 4-minute speech on how he wants to create jobs, and it was on the internet, so it's not exactly Bruce Rauner who's running radio and TV ads and internet banner ads all over the state. Everywhere you look, you see he's going to shake up Springfield. But he's also, being a first-time candidate, maybe this whole episode is an example of how a more seasoned candidate knows that when cameras are on, which by the way is everywhere you go now, even if you're like a normal person at a mall, because everybody has cell phone cameras, anything you say can and will be stuck in time and projectable at some point, and you have to be very careful about what you say. So, Charlie, you know, as we say, or Kent, you know, the walk back, he did do an op-ed in the Tribune talking about how what he really wants is improvements to the business climate and a better climate for everybody. And what they say that I wanted it less. I think he indicated he didn't really say the number 725, but he talked about the states around us, all of which are at 725, and said we must be at their level to compete. And his initial statement was we have to go to that, but he clearly doesn't want that to be the impression left now. Is it too late, and is it fair that it's too late? Can you change your mind?
I think it's perfectly acceptable for someone to mature in terms of their opinion about some issue of public policy. On the other hand, you know, that's something that maybe takes place over a number of years or decades rather than a couple of weeks or a month. So, no, I mean, he can walk it back. It may not be that big a deal long term, but it is what it is in terms of the modern political environment and how much you are on all the time. He's been very good as a first-time candidate about staying on message up to this point and not making these kinds of gaffes. But it is hard for someone who is, they've been used to being in charge in a business environment to be in a political environment where you need to listen to your consultants, listen to your handlers, to be handled as a candidate. And you want to still be sincere and get your real message out there, but you also have to be aware of that the 30-second kill spot is going to trump any kind of long walking back that you make of a statement. And so it's a rookie mistake that maybe he won't repeat, but it may get to be a pattern.
Well, and I look at it too that there's even a downside on saying, well, I misspoke, and flip-flopping, because there are going to be people who say, yeah, you were just you said what you really meant the first time, and you saw that it didn't play well, and so now you're flipping. And there's also a significant element within the Republican primary base that believes that it is economically the wrong thing to do to increase the minimum wage. The argument being that if you force employers to pay people more, they will be less inclined to hire. They may even lay off. And there's a school of thought that says people that make the minimum wage, that's all they deserve. And they're being overpaid.
It's also entry-level jobs for younger people, too.
And we should be fair.
But there was a report from the Economic Policy Institute, and I actually printed it out. The average age of the people who would be affected by an increase in the minimum wage is 35 years old. And a third of them are at least 40. 56% are women, 28% have children, 55% work full-time. And so it's not the notion of it's the high school sophomore or the high school senior who's working bagging groceries somewhere or flipping burgers. It's actually people who have children who are working full-time trying to make ends meet on a wage that is barely above poverty level.
And we have to be fair, not Rauner is not the only candidate that is making mistakes or trying to use this for political advantage. I mean, Senator Dillard was quoted as saying that he was some kind of Jeffersonian and that he thought the marketplace should set the minimum wage, which you could interpret to say we shouldn't have any minimum wage at all. And you can rest assured that Governor Quinn looks at polling and knows that this is an issue where, you can be in favor of $10 minimum wage. That plays well, particularly to your base. And if it doesn't happen during the course of the legislature, you can blame it on the Republicans and everybody else that it doesn't happen. So people are using this for their political advantage in the campaign.
Well, Kent, you talked about staying on message, and it reminds me, I hate to concentrate on Mr. Rauner, but he seems to have set himself out there by spending so much money. But it was at State Fair time when there was a Republican meetings at a hotel in Springfield in the morning, and he drove up on his motorcycle, which was, pretty for pictures. And he didn't want to answer questions about anything but what he was going to say that day, which is, you can interpret as staying on message, but I think you need to do it with more finesse. For example, he had a helmet on. I asked him that morning if he was for a helmet law, which would require motorcycle riders to wear helmets, which very organized political motorcycle riders in Illinois hate that idea because they want the flexibility of not wearing a helmet. And he wouldn't say that morning. He said, I'm here just to talk about X. This isn't the day to talk about issues like that. He later said that he's against a helmet law. He's with those freedom riders, as it were, not to overuse that term. But again, the way that you present yourself to the public, has to be in a way that shows you're willing to answer questions.
And that's the thing, that staying on message, that's fine if you're selling peanut butter.
Right.
But when you want to be the leader of the state,
right,
you can't just stick to the script. You actually have to interact with reporters, with people who, no offense to the general public, but state government reporters generally have a better grasp of the ideas and the policies.
Which is one reason they all stay away from Springfield a lot,
yeah.
except the more experienced ones.
When was the last time Rauner was here? When was the last time you met with the State House Press Corps?
He was at something at the Sangamo Club, and this is a place where I asked him several times about money he had, about certain things, including if he had donated any money to the Illinois Policy Institute, which is a free market think tank that seems to be very much in line with things Bruce Rauner says a lot, including 401k is the best way to go for pensions. And he kept saying, I donated to them, because he had said that on a radio show, but he wouldn't say how much. And he just said, I gave him a lot of money. And he wouldn't say how much. And the next week is when his people conceded to me he had given them $500,000 at least over 5 years, which I think turned into a good story to put into perspective some of the funding that goes to the Illinois Policy Institute, which tries to get involved in many policy debates. But again, he was coy. He was acting as if it was not our right to ask him this question. And that's not a good thing.
No, it's not. And I think if you want to be the governor, you have to respond to these questions. I had a circumstance, this was years ago, obviously, when I was at the Sun-Times. I sat down with a guy who was running for governor, and I had a list of, I don't know, there were dozens of specific policy questions I asked him, and about half the way through he said, well, where did you come up with all this stuff? And I said, well, actually, these are all initiatives that have been introduced in the General Assembly, and were you to be elected governor, you may have to deal with these. And I think the readers of the Sun-Times, and by extension the Illinois public, deserves to know what you think about this stuff. But he was just flabbergasted. He wanted to talk about these vague generalities about equality and economic development and all this, amorphous stuff.
Yeah, and we will, Bruce Rauner has said he's committed to 4 or 5 debates, whatever.
Five, but not until February.
Yeah, and the other candidates are calling for different numbers and
right,
stuff. And so, there sometimes debates can be helpful in terms of giving you a comparison in terms of how people handle themselves as well as the specific issues. Sometimes debates, you get absolutely nothing out of them. And so, but yeah, you have to go beyond the commercials and you have to connect. And that's, it's about message and it's about messenger. And people have to believe that not only are you on, saying the right things, but you're on their side and you understand them. And that's, that's a challenge for any candidate, and it's certainly going to be a challenge for Rauner.
We'll see where it goes. Speaking of messages and messengers, Governor Pat Quinn, obviously running for re-election, and the legislature is supposed to come in at the end of January, I think it's the 29th, and State of the State address set right away that day. It's going to be a difficult and interesting year, partly because half of this budget year is going to include that starts in July, will include the 67%, the 2 percentage point income tax increase that was passed and became effective, in 2011. But then that's supposed to start falling off, much of that in January of 2015. That will be the second half of the year that the General Assembly is working towards as this election is coming up, meaning how will Pat Quinn deal with the impending shortfall of money, or if you say I'm going to extend that income tax or do something else like try to get a constitutional amendment for a graduated income tax, which would make richer people pay more but couldn't be passed in time to affect this budget anyway. How does he deal with that as we have an election ongoing? Because I don't think the governor has said what he wants to do with that extension.
I would think that he's in pretty much of a box, because even were he to come out and say, I think we should continue at the current income tax rates, he can't factor that into the budget, because by law he has to present a budget in which spending does not exceed estimated revenues based on existing law at the time. So he could come in and he could propose raising the income tax to 25% and the sales tax to 50%, and it wouldn't do any good. He couldn't take any of that money and put it into this budget.
Right here.
Well,
anyway.
but I'm using that as
Right.
hyperbole,
Sure.
Because he has to come in and deal with the fact that there's going to be roughly $2 billion less coming in fiscal 2015, and it'll be closer to $5 billion in fiscal 16 because of the reversion of the income tax rates back down to almost where they were before 2011. And he can't do anything other than propose a budget that's going to have to make very severe cuts. And I don't think he can take into account the fact that they passed the so-called pension reform that's going to allow them to put a lot less money into the pension systems in the future, because again, that is not a done deal yet. As a matter of fact, Speaker Madigan was quoted as saying, I don't think he should do that. And since Madigan will have a big hand in drawing up the budget, we're going to be looking at a spring where we're trying to put together a budget, meet all the existing needs with like $2 billion less. And it's going to be a nightmare.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of positioning yourself in terms of the campaign. If you put out a doomsday budget and you say this is how the current revenue and the expected revenue doesn't meet the basic needs, and here's where I'm going to cut things if nothing changes, then the other people running for governor have to take a position. They have to say, well, I'm in favor of huge cuts to corrections and mental health and whatever, or they've got to come up with alternative cuts. And so you can't get by, some of them will try, but you can't get by with essentially saying, well, we're magically going to eliminate waste and fraud and therefore generate enough money to wipe out these cuts, or we'll improve the business climate and we'll have enough revenue by January to take care of a couple of $1 billion hit. And so the governor, it's his job. He has to get specific. He will take heat for the kind of budget he puts out, but that does put the onus on whoever is running for governor in the primary and then in the general to say, okay, here's my plan, here's my alternative. And I think both the public and the media will hold whoever's running against him in the general, to put their feet to the fire. What are your options?
Given that they have to pass a budget by the end of May and then the general election won't be until November, any possibility that they would do something, given the thought that they could come back after the election and amend it in some way?
I think they're going to assume that something's going to change and they're going to have to redo the budget in January. I think that's likely, or they may just hand it to the new governor if it happens to be a Republican and say enjoy.
A couple issues have come out of courts and legislature, including one that this is the year that the concealed carry of firearms is allowed in Illinois. People are able to apply to the state police to get their licenses to do that, but they also need, I think it's 16 hours of training. A lot of this is ongoing. I don't think any licenses have been issued yet. How is that looking, and how will that change anything in Illinois, which is, after all, the last state to allow concealed carry? And it is true the other states have not gone Wild West, so we'll see.
Well, from all indications, it seems to be going along fairly smoothly, although there's been snags and hitches. For example, I saw a story the other day where the requirement for 16 hours of training, the firearm instructors are having a hard time finding slots at the local firing ranges to get the people in to do their would you say, their live firing training. And there's been speed ups or slowdowns depending on how much information the person is able to submit at once. If you do your fingerprinting electronically, you get processed more quickly than if you do it the old, ink pad way. But I think it's going to work out all right. And there's already been signs. One of the things I noticed at the university, which I was sort of taken aback, we have the no guns allowed signs.
The red circle with
yeah,
the slash through a gun?
with the revolver with the red slash through it. So I was not used to seeing those on campus.
And I think you have to give some credit to the state police for administering the program. There certainly were a lot of predictions, particularly among the pro-gun people, that the state police would slow walk it, that they're a bureaucracy that can't handle this, and they've been meeting schedules. They have gotten through what was a backload of firearm identification card applications, and we'll see how it goes, but clearly in terms of, this is not the Obama healthcare site revisited in terms of their ability to get the program up and running, at least in terms of taking applications. And so, sometimes state government actually does work, and I think you probably ought to give credit when you give somebody a task and they seem to perform it adequately.
Yeah,
well,
I agree.
Chicago has been a leader over the years in trying to ban guns or keep them off the streets, and even now I know Mayor Emanuel wants to slow up sales of guns in Chicago as long as possibly can. So we'll still probably see some conflicts that come through the legislature, will we not? And
Because
the ideological battle north versus south.
And you look at some of the amendments that were offered to the concealed carry bill when it was being debated last spring that didn't go anywhere. The notion of if a place serves alcohol, should people be allowed to have a weapon in there? And I believe the way the law is structured, if most of your sales don't involve alcohol, like if you're a restaurant, then people can. But if you're a flat-out saloon, then they can't. And there'll be efforts made to scale that back and maybe say you shouldn't be allowed to have a concealed weapon anywhere that alcohol is served, those kinds of things. And there'll be a constant byplay back and forth, the Second Amendment folks wanting to make it less restrictive, the gun control folks wanting to make it more restrictive. So we'll just see that play out over the years, I'm sure.
But in this session, there will be no appetite either in the House or the Senate and the Democratic leaders to revisit the issue. Everybody's on a roll call. Everybody voted the way that they needed to vote. And so they'll be more than happy for people to introduce all kinds of bills and put out press releases, but we're not going to make any changes in the law. We're going to get, maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, get some experience.
After next November's election.
Yeah.
But what will happen, all those hundreds of bills will be introduced and the bill will go right to Rules Committee and it will not be seen again.
Speaking of ideas, and again, I don't know if this will be one, but it's interesting because I think some of us were around when this happened, and I think it was 1982 when Illinois passed a law that said you can't sell a car as a dealership on a Sunday. And oddly, the dealers wanted that so-called blue law, which has government telling a businesses what to do. Well, now Jim Oberweis, who is a state senator from the Aurora area, who's also running for U.S. Senate, and who also just passed the 70-mile-an-hour speed limit and got it through the legislature as a freshman senator, he wants to repeal the law that says you can't buy a car from a dealer on a Sunday in Illinois. The dealers want it because they say that's the only day off we'll get, and the guy down the street will open up, and we work so hard anyway, we can't compete, or we'll never get a day off, which is odd, but that's the way the dealers feel. And Oberweis is like, this is an anti-business law, it's an anti-consumer law because consumers should be able to shop for a car on Sunday. Will this go anywhere? And is this a good issue for him?
I have to chuckle, and both of us were there when this happened.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, that says how old we are. But to me, the most interesting thing was when somebody said to Senator Oberweis, oh, by the way, the car dealers were the motivating force behind it. Oberweis went, what? Really? It was like he was surprised that car dealers weren't going to subscribe to his notion of let the market decide and free enterprise. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, to be honest.
New car truck dealers are organized. They have a presence in the legislature. They have a building across the street from the Capitol complex, and they make regular contributions. And so they
You don't think that has any effect?
they want the law to stay the way it is. This is, in the abstract, it sounds like there ought to be people in favor of it. When you get to specifics, the only people that really care are the people that are going to want to buy a car sometime next spring, because that's when it would take an effective, immediate effective date. It's very hard to organize the people who might want to buy a car next year to come and be in favor of this change in the legislation. So there's a huge advantage to the organized interest that has a presence rather than the unorganized citizen.
I think we've got about a minute and a half left. Oberweis is not the only Republican candidate for U.S. Senate, and he can do that because he has a 4-year state Senate term, so he can run and stay in the legislature, right, even though he's lost races for some statewide offices before. He can take this risk. There's a guy named Doug Truax from the Chicago suburbs, who is a West Point graduate and in a business that deals with employee benefits, who is a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate. And Oberweis is a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate, and they're both seeking their party's nomination to run against Dick Durbin, the second most powerful man in the Senate, who is considered by many liberal Democrat, lives in Springfield. Do either of these Republicans have a chance, and which one will come out on top, and can they beat Durbin?
I'll go out on a limb and say that it really doesn't matter who comes out on top because they'll lose. I don't see Durbin being beat, and I think it's because he's done a lot of things, paid attention to Illinois, and he can come home and say, here are some of the things that I've done for Illinois, here are some of the areas that I've been in the forefront of, and it's really not bad to have representing your state in the U.S. Senate the number 2 guy.
And in Republican money outside the state and in the state, which you need a lot of money to run for the U.S. Senate, all of that money is focusing on the governor's race, and they're not going to invest in in what they perceive to be a losing cause when there really is a prize there if you were able to elect a Republican governor.
On the national level, even more importantly, there are a lot of other more vulnerable Democrats than Durbin, and if you're big money wanting to elect Democrats to U.S. Senate, that's where it'll go.
Well, Kent Redfield, Charlie Wheeler, thanks for your help and conversation as usual. Thank you for watching. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.